Wow, Mario, you never told me that you had this many games. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. So, which game you want to pick? Well, I think we should pick the game from the greatest gaming console ever made. I think it's around here. Ah, you. Yeah. Yoshi's Cookie on NES. Can you repeat that? Yoshi's Cookie on NES? No, before that. The greatest gaming console ever made? That is where you're wrong. What you mean? Of course it's the greatest gaming console ever made. It's got Yoshi's Cookie. Oh, so does Game Boy, and so does Super Nintendo. And also, NES has lots and lots of bad games. Well, another console could be the greatest console ever made. Oh, really? Then tell me. Okay, well, if you don't like the NES has the best gaming console ever made, what about Sega Saturn? It was a failure financially, and also there weren't really that many recognizable games. Not to mention a couple of them were pretty bad. Well, what about Dreamcast? Also financial failure, although much better games. Sega CD? Who even remembers that much? Sure, a couple people, not many. Well, what about PlayStation? I'll get back to you on that later. Oh, okay. Well, what about PlayStation 2? Not many people know about it besides the fact that it was the most popular sold game. However, in terms of games, there were not really that many that were popular. What about the original Xbox? Same story with the PS2. Sega Master System? A bunch of pretty bad games, and also not the most highest of quality compared to the NES. Aha! That doesn't mean it's the best console. Oh. Nintendo 64? The controllers were a bit off, not to mention a few bad games because of it. Especially Superman. Ugh, that would remind me. Point take it. The PS4. Most of the games there are not really as classic as the others. Huh. Weird. Xbox 360? It's basically the same story as the PS2 and the original Xbox. What about some of the handhelds? Like a DS, Game Boy Advance, and Game Gear. Not really many of them are quite as well beloved as others, not to mention that the Game Boy had a couple of bad games. Also, it was pretty poor quality, even though it was quite high-tech back in the day. It's quite dated. What about TurboGrafx 16? Not really as popular. Well, what about the Atari 2600? It's mostly used for nostalgia, not to mention that there were some pretty bad games in there. Oh. Well, what about Nintendo Gamecube? It's also not as financially successful, even though there's a bunch of pretty damn good games. Super Mario Sunshine. Yeah, I get it. Can you move on? Okay. It's gotta be this one. The PlayStation 3. It is my childhood, but I'd say no. How is this part of your childhood? I'm just kidding. It's not really part of my childhood, but it's definitely part of a couple. But however, it's not really that great. You know, there's not really that many games that I won't know. Okay. Well then, what is the greatest game ever made? I'm glad you asked. Sit back, relax, and let me take you to show you what. Why are you placing me here? Because I can't keep holding you. Okay. Okay. So, when comparing all of these games, it really does come to the question, what is the greatest gaming console ever made? Some say NES, some say Nintendo 64, some say a underrated and unsuccessful gaming consoles that weren't able to get as much money, like Dreamcast and Gamecube, or even some modern consoles like the Nintendo Switch. But when it comes to it, here's what a video game console has to have that makes it perfect. In order for a gaming system to be perfect, it needs to, one, have a lot of good games and barely any bad games. Because with a lot of bad games, that lowers the quality and need of the console. And the gaming console also needs to have pretty good games at highest of quality, and also as well as games that leave a mark on childhood and your life. that of which Yoshi is why I'm going to spend a while before we get playing on the NES to explain to you what could be the best gaming console ever made. Now, after dialing it down, I've decided on 3 gaming consoles: the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation 1, and the Sega Genesis. What are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and what are the identities of all 3 of them? Let's start with the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo came out after the Genesis. Even though it was late on the 16-bit market, it still left a mark into millions of people, as well as being selling a lot of consoles, making it a commercial success. Not to mention that with the game controller, you had extra buttons that are new, and later became standards into controls today, like the shoulder buttons. And with the 16-bit graphics inside of the Super Nintendo, it also made it a pretty fun game to play at, which made it quite an iconic feature inside of it, and also was something that made it one of the most highest quality of gaming that you'll ever see in terms of 2D. It used cartridges, and it used it inside of its fullest potential. The graphics were higher than the original NES, and it showed how much farther that cutscenes and graphics can go. Not to mention that the gameplay was perfect, and it was pretty damn fun. When you play a game like Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country, you're able to play them because they're fun and that you're able to play with them. Not to mention that it had lots and lots of classic games. With these games, you barely had any bad quality, not to mention that some of them were quite iconic, like Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, or it could have something that started a franchise that people come to know and love, like Star Fox or Mario Kart. The factor with some of these games is that it can lead to some pretty classic games. It can lead you to introduce you to some high quality fighting games. It helped introduce concepts of 3D with 2.5D graphics with games like Donkey Kong Country. And these games were also worth your time, and many of them people still talk about to this very day. There's a reason people still talk about Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars. There's a reason people still talk about Super Metroid, because these games took and stood this test of time, and it changed gaming forever. Now, in terms of bad gaming, there weren't really that many bad games, with a few minor exceptions, but even they weren't that bad, besides a few, including, but not limited to, the Wizard of Oz. But that didn't mean that the games were bad. Not to mention that it was super compatible with classic games on the Game Boy, with the Super Game Boy. The add-ons were not pretty much, but it helped it make it a much better console to play even more games on. Not to mention that it started the concept idea of making maps and having the idea of saving. The idea to save games was something that was beyond your usual games inside of other consoles before this. And lots of gaming controllers have a unique aspect, but the ones that came from these 3 consoles make it quite classic. And most notably, with the Super Nintendo. With the buttons, they were pretty simple, and yet they worked. The D-pad, select start, the 4 buttons, the X and Y becoming staples, as well as the shoulder pad buttons. By adding these controls, it made it a lot more fun to play these games. Because with these games, they were pretty easy to do, and they were pretty fun to deal with. Not to mention that it was able to help you enjoy the game. So in other words, the Super Nintendo is near perfection, but we're only at the start. Oh no, this is gonna take a while, isn't it? Yes. Up next, we're going to be taking a look at the gaming console. Now let me first give you some context about Sega itself. By the late 1980s, Nintendo was starting to become the world top dominance of gaming, and having beloved mascots such as Super Mario and Zelda to compete with other games which have iconic characters and games. But with other consoles such as the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Master System, it was hard for any other gaming console to compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System. But then Sega decided to take a chance to compete with Nintendo itself by making a new gaming console, the Genesis, and creating a mascot of their own, one that could compete with Mario's awesomeness and coolness, as well as the level of inspiration and transcending a generation of gaming. It was one of the rare consoles that kicked Nintendo's butt and made itself a worthy competitor into gaming. And like the Super Nintendo, there was barely any bad games at all. Not to mention, most of them were quite legendary, and some iconic, none other more than Sonic the Hedgehog himself. Not to mention about the fact that Sonic had something that other gaming consoles didn't think of before: speed. With the game Super Mario Bros., you had a lot more action and adventure, and also as a bunch of platforming and battling. Not to mention about the fact that then with Sonic, you were able to go fast and do things beyond time. Sure, Sonic and Nintendo also did games that involved action and adventure, but with Sonic, you had the need for speed, and you wanted to go fast. It gave this extra boost of energy into people, and also was the graphics were colorful and ahead of their time. Remember, this was right before the Super Nintendo was out. So, after the TurboGrafx 16, the Sega Genesis made itself a worthy competitor onto this gaming console market. And the gaming controllers were equally as recognizable as the Super Nintendo. But, you know, it didn't have as many buttons, but it did get the job done. Not to mention that it made a comfortable platforming way with its joypad, making the games more fun to do. Not to mention that both this and the Super Nintendo has what modern consoles don't have as much: the simple art form, the line. You see, with 3D graphics, it made it a lot more realistic, and also not to mention that there was still 2D games, but they weren't quite as recognizable or quite as iconic, not to mention that the controls were much harder, as well as being too realistic into the uncanny valley, which made games harder to compete or be different and unique from others. But with games on the consoles like the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, it gave a unique art style, and also a lot more basic stuff for you to try to combine together with the limited technology that you have. Because I can tell you right now, Sonic and Mario would not be the same if they were in 3D instead of 2D at first. But that's not to say that the Sega also tried to compete with the level of Nintendo, which made it quite iconic as the console itself. So it competed with things such as fighting games and 3D graphics. Now, granted, the way that the gaming console handled with 3D graphics was not as quite iconic as Donkey Kong Country or what game after it, but however, it was at least trying to compete. If you just gave up on competing, the person that beats you will just keep winning, and then you'll just have the shame of losing. And that's what made Sega a underdog to love and enjoy. And with games such as Streets of Rage, there was much more iconic games to play with. I'm like, what is it that Super Nintendo has that Sega Genesis doesn't? Racing games that are popular like Mario Kart? Too soon, Yoshi, man. Too soon. But however, just because the 3D graphics were bad inside of, or were not as recognizable as for nowadays, or even for back then, that didn't mean that all gaming consoles with 3D didn't have terrible games with 3D, or had stuff that was unrecognizable, which in this case comes to the PlayStation 1. Now, PlayStation started out with Nintendo once again. PlayStation wanted to join in with Nintendo, and then a bunch of problems occurred, a couple of fights that will go into other explanations that other video game reviewers could go into. But however, the short of it to say is, Nintendo and PlayStation didn't get along with basically Sony and Nintendo itself. So then they created the PlayStation itself 2 years before the Nintendo 64 in 1994. It started off with 2D gaming, but then it moved forward into 3D gaming, and it made it compete with the Nintendo 64. First off, with the 2D graphics, it became the most highest of quality as it was until the modern gaming consoles of now. And it made it a lot more iconic and recognizable to play with. That isn't to say that the gaming console just only had 2D gaming. But however, all I can say is the fact that it made it quite iconic and recognizable. Another thing is that with the games like that came from Sega and Nintendo, most of the time they were usually nice and height-warming for children and slightly older kids. but never for teenagers and adults. Not to mention that they didn't take themselves quite as seriously. Yes, they did have serious games such as, well, Streets of Rage and Mortal Kombat and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time or Link to the Past. PlayStation took serious gaming to a whole new level. Not to mention that when it came with PlayStation, there was a lot more to compete with in terms of the graphics. Not to mention that the gameplay made it more fun, and as well as the expanded diversity of different genres such as horror, racing, fighting, and adventure. Not to mention that it started the idea of doing discs for gaming. Yes, this came already way back in the day of the Nintendo Entertainment System with disc drives, but however, they were basically used for computers and not actual discs. Yes, keep in mind that this is the time during of Laserdisc. But later on, PlayStation came up with the idea to do discs for gaming, and that was what made it pretty good and quite something interesting. It gave a lot more save time, not to mention that it gave to much better graphics. Granted, not all games had quality that was quite amazing or perfection. Even during the beginning ages of time, games that came before PlayStation even had better graphics too. Some games were able to compete, and some just didn't, such as Spider-Man and Final Fantasy VII, which took things too realistic and started the uncanny valley of expression and environment. But however, that isn't to say that the games weren't as quite recognizable either. There are reasons people still talk about games such as Tomb Raider and Crash Bandicoot, because games like these were iconic and stood the test of time. They competed with Nintendo and Sega with what they were doing, and it completely far-fetched out the competition. Another thing that made it stand out from these two was the controller. Granted, when the console came out, it wasn't having joysticks at the time. Nintendo 64 was the one to start off the idea of joysticks. But the way they did the analog stick made it much more iconic and unique. It had one for you to move the characters, and another one to change your perspective on the characters. You didn't have to press a button anymore, and it made your fingers feel a lot more loose and free. Not to mention that it started a new generation of gaming for quite a number of the audience. Imagine that mindset of having many games to choose from that weren't very limited into the type of genre, with having more games related to different genres. Sure, not all of them were great or perfect, or high quality of graphics, but however, they did stand the test of time, and it's something that you can remember to this very day. Well, I guess that makes sense for the PlayStation, but then it comes to the question, which one is the one that's the best? That, my dear Yoshi friend, is an excellent question. Now with these free gaming consoles, it's really hard to choose, but however, with each of these, you still have to sacrifice something. With the PlayStation, you sacrifice a bunch of good games and also as well as some bad quality in some games. But with the Sega Genesis, you sacrifice multiple different genres, being for more than just for kids, and also as well as having stuff to make your fingers feel more or move more freely. Not to mention that the controller wasn't as iconic as I thought it would be. I changed my mind. It turns out it's not something that you can remember as much. But it did become a worthy competitor to start the competition with Nintendo. And with Super Nintendo, you sacrificed with a few bad games. And sure, there weren't that many, but they were still bad games nonetheless, and some of them left a mark on people for the worst. But then, which one would it be? You know, that's actually a good question, and I think I know the answer to it officially. Between all of them, I think it's safe to say Sega Genesis was number one, the best gaming console ever created. It made games that left a mark onto people. With the genres it had, like fighting, adventure, and sports, you still had quite a good number of things to play. Not to mention that there was little to absolutely no bad games inside of the Genesis. With Super Nintendo, you would have about 50 or 10 bad games. For Genesis, there was little to no bad games, like at least 10 or 12, but not that many that were bad. And even though the controller is not perfect, it still got the job done. And that's what a controller needs to do. And so are the games. The games that make you feel so iconic and also leave a mark inside of your childhood. So there you have it. Sega Genesis is the best gaming console made. Now, granted, that does not mean that all of the consoles are bad. However, that one is the one that is at its prime and at its best. So, if you ask somebody, what was the best game console ever made? You tell them straightforward, it's the Sega Genesis. Sega was a worthy competitor, and also, as well as the most perfect console that the business has created. Wow, that was really something. Yeah. Hey, so, you wanna play Yoshi's Cookie? Yeah, alright. It was a great speech. Thanks.